Hello, this is Matt Dean with A Plus College Ready, and today we're going to talk about thermoregulation. Thermoregulation is the process of regulating the internal temperature of an organism. We're going to talk about two main strategies for carrying out thermoregulation. Many organisms are ectotherms. These are organisms whose body temperatures vary greatly with the external environment. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as cold-blooded. I would prefer you use the term thermoconformers, and that means that their internal temperature conforms to or becomes the same as the external temperature. Ectotherms include things like most fish, most reptiles, most amphibians, and most invertebrates and insects. And again, as the external temperature drops, the body temperature of the organism drops. Because it's colder inside the body, almost all metabolic activities slow down. As the external temperature rises, the body temperature rises. And this causes an increase in metabolic activity. Almost everything in the body happens faster under hot temperatures. An advantage of being an ectotherm is that the organisms don't have to use energy, ATP, to produce heat to regulate their body temperature. This means they don't have to eat as much as endotherms, which we'll talk about in a minute. The disadvantage of being an ectotherm is that ectotherms can't normally live in places that get too hot or too cold. If they do live in these environments, their activity is limited to only certain parts of the day or certain seasons of the year. So ectotherms are limited in terms of where they can live and when they can be active. Here we see a graph that compares the animal's internal temperature to the outside temperature. And notice that they are directly proportional to each other. As outside temperature increases, internal temperature of the organism increases as well. It's a direct relationship. Now let's talk a little bit about endotherms. These are organisms who maintain their body at a metabolically favorable, nearly constant temperature. And they do this by using heat set free by internal bodily functions, mainly cellular respiration. These organisms don't rely purely on ambient heat for thermoregulation. They generate the heat through metabolism. You've heard these organisms called warm-blooded before. I would prefer you use the term thermoregulators. They regulate their internal temperature. They keep it constant. Changes in the external temperature have little effect on the internal temperature of the organism. If the external temperature drops, an endotherm will either generate or trap body heat to maintain a constant internal temperature. They can do that in a lot of ways. There's different mechanisms they can do that. One, they can shiver. They can rub muscles together very quickly to generate heat. They can increase the rate of metabolism or cell respiration. Cell respiration, aerobic cell respiration releases heat. So they can increase their rate of cell respiration. They can do vasoconstriction of the blood vessels near the skin. So this is why when you get cold, oftentimes your skin gets a little blue because the blood vessels near the skin constrict. They go from a wide diameter down to a small diameter, and that keeps the blood away from the surface of the body so that the heat doesn't leave the body through the skin. If the external temperature rises, an endotherm will use different ways to lower that, to keep the temperature constant. These would be things like sweating or evaporative cooling, panting, or vasodilation of the blood vessels near the skin, making the blood vessels go from a smaller diameter to a bigger diameter. That sends more blood to the surface of the skin, and therefore more heat can be lost to the environment. Endotherms oftentimes use what we call negative feedback loops, like the one included on the next slide, to regulate their internal temperature. So here's a negative feedback loop. So here's the set point temperature. For humans, this is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's say you've been exercising and your body temperature is getting hot. So you have receptors in the skin, thermoreceptors, that pick up an increase in body temperature. Those send messages to the brain, typically to an important part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It notes the increase in temperature, and it will send out signals to structures called effectors. An effector in this case might be a blood vessel, or it might be a sweat gland. And essentially the hypothalamus is telling that effector, hey, it's too hot. You need to lower the temperature, in this case by releasing sweat. So the sweat glands become active, the sweat's released onto the skin, the sweat absorbs body heat, evaporates, and takes it out. That lowers the body temperature. Now, those receptors continue to monitor the body temperature. That's why this is called feedback. And they will continue, this loop will continue until the temperature returns to the set point. Once it does, those receptors stop sending signals to the hypothalamus, which will then stop sending signals to the sweat gland. So negative feedback is always pushing the body back to a set point, always pushing it back toward the homeostatic set point. On the bottom of this loop, we see the opposite problem. So here, the thermoreceptors note that body temperature is dropping. It's getting too cold. They send a message to the hypothalamus. It sends out messages to effectors. In this case, maybe a skeletal muscle telling it to shiver. That generates body heat, raises the body temperature back up. And again, that loop continues until the temperature returns to the homeostatic set point. At that point, the thermoreceptors will stop sending the signals to the hypothalamus. It will stop sending signals to the skeletal muscles, which will then stop shivering. So that's a negative feedback loop. So here we see a graph that compares external temperature to internal temperature, internal body temperature. And as we noted on a slide a couple of minutes ago, with an ectotherm like a lizard, as external temperature increases, internal temperature increases. But notice with an endotherm like a mouse or a human, as external temperature increases, internal temperature remains the same. That's why endotherms are called thermoregulators. We keep our body temperature constant. So examples of endotherms include the birds and the mammals and a handful of fish. An advantage of being an endotherm is that the internal temperature is independent of the external environmental temperature. This allows endotherms to live in almost all habitats and to be active in almost all those habitats. The disadvantage of being an endotherm is that in order to maintain that constant temperature, an organism has to use a lot of energy to generate heat. This requires that the endotherms eat on a regular basis and then they eat a large amount of food. So food is required, lots of food, to be an endotherm. Now, another thing that we often get asked about is how do the metabolic rates compare between organisms? In general, regardless of the temperature, endotherms are going to have higher metabolic rates than ectotherms, because endotherms are using cell respiration not only to make ATP, but also to generate heat. As the external temperature drops, the metabolic rate of an ectotherm will also drop because it's getting cold inside that ectotherm's body. For an endotherm, the rate will either remain unaffected, or if the temperature drops a lot, the endotherm will actually increase the metabolic rate in order to generate additional heat to maintain a body temperature. As the external temperature increases, the metabolic rate of an ectotherm will rise quickly, whereas the metabolic rate of an endotherm will either be unaffected or it may actually drop a little bit to slow down the release of heat from within the body. The metabolic rates of endotherms per kilogram tend to decrease dramatically with body mass. What that means is that why that happens as the body size increases, the surface area to volume ratio of the body decreases. This means that larger endotherms don't lose heat as easily as smaller ones do. They're better at keeping the heat within their body. And since they don't lose as much heat, larger endotherms don't have to generate as much heat per cell or per kilogram. Smaller endotherms, on the other hand, have a higher surface area to volume ratio. They lose a lot of heat to the environment, and therefore, because they're losing it, they have to generate more heat to maintain a constant temperature. So smaller endotherms are always going to have a higher metabolic rate per cell or per kilogram than larger endotherms. Here we can see that. So notice a tiny endotherm like a shrew has this hugely high basal metabolic rate, whereas a large endotherm like an elephant is very small. And that's again because this one has a smaller surface area to volume ratio. And it doesn't lose heat as easily to the environment. Where these small endotherms have a large surface area to volume ratio, and they lose heat easily to the environment. Since they're endotherms, if they lose heat, they have to generate heat to maintain a constant internal temperature. So here we're seeing a comparison of the rate of oxygen consumption, which is essentially a way to measure the rate of cell respiration. And we're looking at what happens as temperature, outside temperature or ambient temperature increases. Notice as it increases in an ectotherm, a lizard, the rate of oxygen consumption goes up. Because if it's hotter on the outside, it's hotter inside this lizard, its metabolic rate happens faster. Whereas with an endotherm, if it gets really hot, to maintain a constant internal temperature, the metabolic rate actually drops. And this is so that the mouse, in this case, isn't generating as much internal heat. So that's our presentation on thermoregulation. Hope that helps.